For more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Andreas Krieg, who works at the Defence Studies Department at King's College in London. Thanks very much for coming in. So first of all, just how credible is this version of events from the Saudis that somehow the Crown Prince was not involved in the decision, given that it happened right there in a consulate? Is that a credible version of events, do you think?
No, but I mean, what is remarkable is that over the last 6 weeks, we see an increasingly merger of these two stories. So initially, we see the Saudis denying everything, saying we had nothing to do with it, he never came or he left. And now we're at a point where they're saying, actually, he came, he was killed, and he was even dismembered. What's also significant is that someone like Saad al-Qahtani was now somewhat incriminated in the prosecutor's statement. But obviously what they're trying to do is they're trying to build a case that is somewhat detached from the Crown Prince himself, and I think that's very problematic. Anybody who understands the system, Mohammed bin Salman, that has been built up over the last year and a half at least, is one which is very centralized, very much centralized, revolving directly around Mohammed bin Salman. He's a man who doesn't sleep more than 5 hours a night, who has directly micromanagement, decision-making capabilities in all aspects of foreign policy and also defense policy, economic policy. But definitely when it comes to something as significant as taking someone out, killing someone who is actually a resident of the United States, that's something that would not happen without the knowledge of Mohammed bin Salman, and that has to be made clear.
So, I mean, what about this, the fact that Saudi Arabia, some people have pointed out that it's not the first time Saudi Arabia has been involved in a rendition, if that's what it was supposed to be in this case?
No, I think the rendition story is somewhat true. It doesn't make it any better. I mean, to say as a defence, well, it's a rendition gone wrong, we just wanted to kidnap him and make him disappear, is not really something that will go down well with Western policymakers and journalists. But I think this is what was actually intended. They wanted to kidnap him and take him back home. What they would have done to him in Saudi Arabia is a completely different story. We have two particular cases of princes that disappeared over the last 6 years. One is Sultan bin Turki, who was the ambassador to Switzerland, who was at that time was a prince who was intoxicated in the embassy, was flown on a medevac plane, unconscious medevac plane to Saudi Arabia, disappeared. Nobody's ever heard from him since. Another story we have is of Turki bin Bandar, who was somewhat of a dissident who went into self-imposed exile in Paris, and they kind of tried to lure him back and kidnapped him. He also disappeared. So there is a somewhat a long list of stories, and there are a lot of other princes who live overseas who have been somewhat dissidents, also living under fear and pressure and not fearing every step they're taking outside the door that possibly something could happen to them. So that we have that story. We have this history of Saudi Arabia doing this, and I think in this case it seemed that they wanted to intoxicate him and possibly also do the same thing that they did to Sultan bin Turki, putting him on a medevac flight under the coverage of diplomatic immunity and fly him to Saudi Arabia and make him disappear.
So, I mean, the Saudis have been clearly hoping to draw a line under this whole affair with these arrests and then announcing now that there's going to be the death penalty for some of those involved. Will what they've announced now be enough to take the heat off the Saudi leadership?
The heat from where is the question. So, I memean, if we look at the media coverage, the media coverage has been intense, somewhat unprecedented on Saudi Arabia. And we've seen in the last 4 or 5 weeks, this has somewhat died down. There's still a lot of coverage, particularly in the United States. But I think that's not really significant. What is significant is what are policymakers in the West going to do with that information? How are they going to react? So there is a tape. I know people who have listened to the tape, and it seems to be authentic. The Turks have released this to a couple of decision makers in the West that they deem to be allies. So despite all this evidence that's there, and there is still a significant gap between the version of truth that the Saudis are telling and the truth that comes out of this tape, despite all this, it seems like nobody wants to get Mohammed bin Salman somewhat on, if we remove Mohammed bin Salman, the whole system will break down. So that's the big fear in the West. And I think the Trump administration is key here. I think the Trump administration is the one that would probably want to find a way to basically take the heat off him and say, look, they're doing what they were told to do. They're holding people accountable, and let's move forward.
And so on that, I mean, how much difference will those US sanctions make? They've picked up these 17 people sanctions. Is that going to be the end of it, do you think, if indeed the decision is to leave Mohammed bin Salman alone?
There's a trial and error here. I mean, the US administration is trying to find a way to take the heat off. Congress said, some congressmen, bipartisan, said today that's not going to be enough. What we will not see is Mohammed bin Salman being indicted. What we will not see is Mohammed bin Salman being removed. So the next step in terms of sanctions is to sanction Saudi Arabia as a country rather than 17 individuals. And that might be the next step forward when we're looking at arms deals and also the civilian nuclear deal that was supposed to be signed. So that could be a next step for the Trump administration. But I don't think at this point this is what Trump wants to do, because after all, the entire US strategy in the Middle East is built around the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There's not going to be, they don't want to remove Saudi Arabia or weaken Saudi Arabia any further.
I mean, you've mentioned the Trump angle. We've had people like Jeremy Hunt, the UK Foreign Secretary, going there. And what do we think that he said? Was it just kind of quiet chat? Don't do this again, chaps? Or what was the kind of the messaging coming from the UK, do you think?
The UK is similar. I mean, the UK has post-Brexit. I mean, we're at, in this kind of state of uncertainty. The United Kingdom needs kind of allies all over the world outside of Europe, and Saudi Arabia is very much an ally, particularly as a means to make money. And I think Britain can't do without the potential of billions of dollars of arms deals. And they, again, are manoeuvring around, trying to find a way out of this crisis to tell the public, say, look, action has been taken in Saudi Arabia, let's move on, because after all, we need Saudi Arabia.
Andreas Krieg, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you.